But for those of us who have been doing these things for a while, I pray that, the point of a lot of this is that we would remember, we need to remember what it was like for us in coming this direction, what it was like when we started to where you are now, that we can marvel at the work of God in our lives, that we can marvel at His grace that He has shown us and how He has grown each of us. And so for all of us, I pray that we can get a better grasp and understanding of the words that Paul had said in 1 Corinthians 5, where he says, get rid of the old chametz so you may be a new batch, just as you are unleavened, for Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Maybe like me, I assume y'all are like me, that verse didn't mean as much until I actually started keeping the feast, which is what the next verse actually calls us to. Of what it means to get rid of the chametz, what it means to the Passover lamb is all about. It should give us a better appreciation of what John the Baptist, the immerser, says in chapter 1, where he says, the next day John sees Yeshua coming to him and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." So there's something in Passover, what's supposed to be this memorial, that reminds us, it should remind us of that slavery from Egypt, and that's connected to our own redemption, which is slavery to sin. We need to be redeemed from that. Something about the blood of the Lamb that protects God's people from even death points to Messiah and His work on our behalf, as He is working as the faithful servant. There's that unblemished, that spotless Lamb that dies so that the people may live. They experienced that in Egypt, and it's a reminder of all of those things. And so we're coming, still in Isaiah, and we're coming to the servant song, the fourth servant song. And I'm not going to do all of this justice today, so I'm not getting as far as I would like. But there is so much in this to deal with, to unpack. We see that faithful servant in Isaiah, and he's giving it in the midst of a message, in the middle of this message to this nation that's been in decline, both Israel and Judah, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, some of which the northern kingdom is already gone. It's given to this nation in decline, to a people who are themselves in the southern kingdom of Judah, soon to be taken off again into captivity. We've been reading in Isaiah 40, 41, 42 through 55. It really begins what is called these servant songs, this sequence that's designed to give Israel hope. It's designed to give this people comfort when they've seen judgment and when they know that more is coming. It's during the course of these songs that we see, sometimes we've looked at it, sometimes Israel is called the servant. Other times, Israel being the servant doesn't quite fit. And we've looked at some of those Aramaic, those targums, those translations from the first century, the century before and after Yeshua, how Jewish thought understood that this servant is also at times the Messiah. And sometimes they're hard to tell apart. Which one is he talking about? Which one is which? Because they both have the same role. They're both supposed to be the light to the Gentiles. They're both supposed to bring God's Torah to the nations. And Jewish thought reveals that they understood that there is a distinction. There's these two servants being described. The servant Israel, which is, he is the whole point of the book of Isaiah. They've proven to be unfaithful in that role, in that calling. They've proven to be warranting of God's judgment. But He also wants them to understand, as Paul talks about in Romans chapter 11, that their gifts and their calling is still irrevocable, that He will not break the promises that He has made. But Israel is at times identified as the servant. He says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, descendant of Abraham, my friend, I took hold of you from the ends of the earth and called you from its uttermost parts. And I said to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you, not rejected you. And they need to remember that. They need to know that. Not lose sight of that truth. This is something that the world is forgetting right now, aren't they? They are forgetting this truth. And you're seeing it all across the country on campuses. Young people all over the place don't realize that this is true. He has chosen them. They have not been rejected. And that has not changed. But there's also this reality, about the faithful servant. Even though that they have been unfaithful in many respects and have broken the covenant and are deserving of that judgment that's coming, they are still called. But then there's also the faithful servant, the one who actually does keep the covenants perfectly, the one who is that faithful servant. And we see in those Targums, Isaiah 42:1, he says, "Behold, my servant the Messiah, whom I bring, my chosen, in whom one delights. As for my word," that's that word memra, "I will put my Holy Spirit upon him, and he shall reveal my judgment unto the nations." That idea of the word, the memra, that's what John is drawing from in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. It's all within traditional Jewish thought. And Isaiah, he's continuing to make the case that God is just, and He is right in disciplining Israel and Judah, the nations that are in decline. They are once again trapped in slavery, that they are once again in need of rescue and redemption. This unfaithful nation needs a faithful servant, one like unto Moses, who will perform, as Isaiah is describing things and talking about things, a second or a greater exodus. For an event that deserves a song. As significant as the one that Moses sang after the crossing of the Red Sea, Yom Suf. It says in verse 10, he says, "Sing to Adonai a new song, His praise from the end of the earth. You who go down to the sea with all its fullness, islands and their inhabitants." So he is drawing upon this kind of imagery. And what he is going to see through the working of the faithful servant, the Messiah, is worthy of a new song. Just a chapter later, the faithful servant is declared again in chapter 43. He says, "You are my witness." It is a declaration of Adonai. "And my servant," and at this point it's not specified who the servant is. In the Hebrew text, he says, "My servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am He, and before me no God was formed, and there will be none after me." Now, what you realize, the most prominent person, that title of my servant, the most prominent person to be called that servant was Moses. You see that in Numbers chapter 12. He says, "Hear now my words," he said. "When there is a prophet of Adonai, I reveal myself in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. In all my house he is faithful. I speak with him face to face, plainly and not in riddles. He even looks at the form of Adonai. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Moses is the one that's called that. It's said again in Joshua chapter 1. He says, "Now it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of Adonai, that Adonai spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, and Moses' aide, saying, My servant Moses is dead. So now arise, you and all these people, cross over this Jordan to the land that I am giving to them, to Bnei Yisrael." And so Isaiah, when he is drawing back to all of this language of the Exodus that's here in this section, when he is using the term of my servant, he is connecting the faithful servant to Moses as a second Moses leading a greater Exodus. And so by the time of Yeshua, the Jewish people, they understood that such a person, such a second Moses, is going to be the Messiah. We were reading Isaiah 43:10. Again, the Targum reveals that identifies that same servant. Remember, he wasn't identified in the Hebraic text, but he identifies the servant in 43:10 this way. He says, "You are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant, the Messiah, in whom is my delight." Again, that's the first and second century, or first century before BC, and the first century in Yeshua's lifetime. That's how it was understood. That was read commonly in the synagogues. The Messiah in whom is my delight, in order that ye may know, and that ye may believe in me, and understand that I am he who was from the beginning. Yea, ages after ages are mine, and beside me there is no God. And what's really interesting in that is as the servant is the Messiah, it makes something very interesting in the Hebrew text next, which was very interesting, I thought. He says in 43:11, he says, I am Adonai, and there is no Savior beside me. That word Savior, if any of y'all can read that real quick, is Moshiach. Moshiach. On one hand, that's a very similar word to the name Moshe, which is Moses, right? Y'all see, at least hear the similarity? On the other hand, it also sounds very close to another word, Mashiach, Messiah. There's word plays in the language, not necessarily by what we see or hear in the English, it's by how it sounds. And this servant, this one like unto Moses, and at the same time is also like the Messiah, he is continuing to lead this new Exodus. Verse 16, it says, "Thus says Adonai, who makes a way in the sea and a path in the mighty waters." Does that sound like anything? "Who drew out chariots and horses. The army and the warrior, they will lie down together and will not rise again. They are extinguished and quenched like a wick." Do not remember, as great as that event was, as great as the Exodus was in drawing even the chariots of Egypt out into the water or to be drowned, he's saying, do not remember former things, nor consider things of the past. Here I am doing a new thing. He is doing a new redemption. And it will parallel. There will be similarities. There will be things that you can see connections with. But as we looked at 2 weeks ago in Isaiah 52, unlike what's different from the first Exodus, where they didn't even have time to let the bread rise, this time it's going to be different. This time there will be no one chasing them, essentially. No one threatening their exodus. Isaiah 52:12 puts it like this. He says, "This time, for you will not go out in haste, nor will you go in flight, for Adonai will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard." You're not going to have to worry about what's in front. You're not going to have to worry about what's behind. Right? If you remember in the Exodus, they couldn't go by the sea because there were all of those fortifications, those Egyptian forts and things along the way, and God was concerned, saying if they go that way, they might see more fighting and conflict and war and turn back. They're not going to have to worry about that in this second Exodus. And they're not going to have to worry about Pharaoh and his army pursuing them from behind like they did last time. And so that's what this second Exodus is supposed to be a picture of. And this leads us to the beginning of the fourth servant song, Isaiah 52, verse 13. And it goes all the way to the end of 53. Remember, when this text was written, there weren't any chapters, there weren't any verses. So the divisions that we see, the breaks that we see, were these later additions, these interpretations of things. And this section of 52:13 and forward, this has been a source of great debate of the meaning of these things. The source of of what has been called, the Christian church and rabbinic Judaism over the centuries. But what's amazing about this is this one sequence, this servant song, is quoted 7 times in the New Testament. You'll see it like this. It's going to go in order as they appear in Isaiah, not in the New Testament order. But you have 52 verse 15 shows up in Romans chapter 15. 53 verse 1 shows up in John 12 verse 38. And I'll go over these in a future message. 53:1 is also quoted in Romans chapter 10. 53 verse 4 is Matthew chapter 8. 53 verses 5 and 6 are in 1 Peter chapter 2, 24 and 25. 53, 7 and 8 is in Acts chapter 8. And then again 53:9 is quoted a few verses earlier in 1 Peter chapter 2. So all of those verses are quoted in the New Testament. Do you think that means that they consider this section important, insightful, to understand the faith and understand who Messiah is? In fact, this song was featured so prominently by the early Jewish believers in Yeshua that there's debate, there's a discussion, it can be argued today that there was a backlash that took place among those who didn't accept him. There's One for Israel, that video, that ministry that we've highlighted here, recently had a 3-part video series on how the early Jewish believers in Messiah and the writers in the New Testament influenced elements of the practice within the synagogue today. And there's scholars even today from Israel that are saying, yeah, that's pretty apparent that this is the case. It influenced even things like a synagogue reading cycle, where there's readings from the Haftorah, from the prophets, were removed if they were featured prominently in the New Testament. And the 4th servant song in Isaiah 53 was one of those. And I'll show you a picture if it's not too blurry. Hopefully it won't be. We have our reading guide over there, our Torah portion guide. When you think about what's missing in here, this is the Haftorah portions. When you look right in there, it goes from Isaiah 51 to verse 12 to 52 verse 12, and then it jumps all the way over to chapter 54 for no apparent reason. And it's not like this is the only time that this happens either. Look just a little bit further down. It goes from Isaiah chapter 60, 1 through 22. Then it skips all the way over to 61, verse 10. What's missing there? It's a passage that's featured very prominently in the Gospels. It's Isaiah 61, the first 2 verses of this passage. See if you recognize this or if it sounds familiar at all. It says, "The Ruach Adonai Elohim is upon me. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Because Adonai has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of Adonai's favor." Does that passage sound familiar? But it seems to be in the cycle. It was okay for him to be reading that for that week, and that's why it's considered to have changed, is that's no longer in the current reading cycle. And Yeshua stops to proclaim the year of Adonai's favor, which is describing what he's about to do. And he stops there because the second part is about what he will do. And proclaim and the day of our God's vengeance, to comfort all those who mourn. That's what's in the future. So this 4th servant song was so controversial, was so rejected by what became that traditional rabbinic Judaism that it appears to be removed from the reading cycle. In modern Judaism, many interpret the servant as Israel, a position that's been made most popular by a rabbi named Rashi in about 1000 to 1100 AD. But this was a position that apparently was not the ancient position, nor always the most accepted like it has been today. Some of these quotes, he says, while it's true that Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Radak all interpreted the passage with reference to Israel, other equally prominent leaders such as Moses ben Nachman or the Rambam felt compelled to follow the weight of ancient tradition. So they're looking back to earlier interpretations and embrace the individual messianic interpretation of the Talmudic rabbis. It says Rabbi Moshe al-Sheikh, writing in the 16th century, so this is the 1500s, he says, our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the Messiah, and we shall ourselves also adhere to the same view. So even 400 years after Rashi, the question hasn't been settled. And the fourth servant song within elements of traditional Judaism was so rejected because it was so prominently featured in things like the New Testament, within Christian teaching and understanding of things, that it was considered to be a forgery that had been inserted into copies of Isaiah. It was thought like that for centuries. And that was thought at least a plausible idea until 1948, when there was a 20-foot long scroll of Isaiah that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the one that's featured in the scroll of the book, and it dates to about 100 BC is the estimated date. And they have the whole thing out there for everybody to see. So it couldn't be this forgery. And if it wasn't a forgery, then the real question becomes, then who is the servant? That even mirrors a question that shows up in the Gospels. Who do you say that I am? Remember that? Some say this, some say that. And it forces us to ask that question, okay, so who is the servant? Who is this one that is leading redemption, and what are they accomplishing? Isaiah 52 verse 13 starts like this: behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. So is the servant, if you're asking that question, is the servant Israel, like we see in chapter 41 verse 8, 44 verse 1, and 21, which is often reminding the reader of how they've acted unfaithfully and deserving of what's happening in this situation? Or is the servant a faithful remnant of Israel? That's a proposal that's put out there. Or is the faithful servant the Messiah? And again, it reflects Jewish thought from his own day. Right? Whoops. He says, this servant, he prospers. And when it's talking about prospering, it's talking about he's acting wisely. He has insight. He is doing the things that the Lord wants him to do. He has success in all that he does. So far, when you're looking at Isaiah, when you're reading through this book, Israel and Judah, they haven't been acting very wisely. That's why everything is happening the way it is. Not even someone who's a good king, like Hezekiah just a few chapters earlier. He may have been a good king in the eyes of God, but he wasn't always very wise. In fact, he showed off the riches and blessings of God to an envoy from Babylon. And it basically, this good king brought on the Babylonian invasion and exile. That's not a very good idea. And if you start thinking about that idea, the servant, who is it? Is it Israel? Is it a faithful remnant? The next phrase actually makes it difficult to hold to that position. Because it says he will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. That's really what that picture of coming and lifting up the Torah scroll. You're exalting it, you're lifting it up, you're showing that it's in that high position. And next time you have to remind me not to have sweaty hands the next time I try to do that, because I could feel it slipping the whole time, and I was like, oh, let's hurry up. That's not what you're supposed to do. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. This is more than just a downtrodden people being victorious or the last becoming first, because you've got to see how Isaiah uses this phrase. This is the kind of phrase, the exact kind of phrasing that's used back in Isaiah chapter 6, where he says, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw Adonai sitting on a throne. What is it? High and lifted up. This language is language like that. This is drawing one's attention to his place, how he is high and lifted up, and the train of his robe fills the temple. It's really the same couple of words used to describe it. And I can't remember. It's like Ram and Nassau. I think those are the two words. They're both in there in each passage. High and lifted up doesn't sound like anything that should be said of an unfaithful nation or people, or even a remnant. Doesn't warrant a description like what happens to Adonai himself. So again, what does the Aramaic say? The Targums, he says, behold, my servant, the Messiah, shall prosper. He shall be exalted and extolled, and he shall be very strong. The Messiah is the one who will prosper. He's the one who's going to act wisely. He's going to fulfill the mission that has been given to him. He's going to succeed, and Messiah will be the one that's high and lifted up and exalted. That's that Hebrew word nasa. If you think of the Lord my banner, the Lord Yehovah Nisi, if you remember that, Adonai Nisi. That's a related word, which means banner, something elevated, lifted up on a pole that becomes a rally point for the people or for an army unit. It's the same kind of word that's used when the ark, when they put the poles into the ark of the covenant and they lift up the ark and carry it. That's what it means to be exalted and extolled. It's the same kind of related word with the bronze serpent was lifted on the pole that the people, if you remember, they were getting bitten by snakes, and they had to look to that bronze snake on the pole to be healed. Right? This mirrors even the kind of language that's used in Philippians chapter 2, talking about Messiah. For this reason God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Yeshua every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, to the glory, and every tongue profess that Yeshua the Messiah is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. What's interesting about this is, Philippians ends with this high and exalted status. But that passage in Philippians doesn't start that way. It starts with his humility, a voluntary humbling, a laying aside of power and glory in order to serve. He did not consider this equality with God something to be grasped, something to be held onto and clung to. But he lowered himself. taking on the form of a servant. Y'all remember that? And even though Isaiah starts with this prospering, he's starting there with a prospering and exaltation, that seems to be the end of the process and not the beginning. Because here begins what the other interpretation starts to build its case. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, just as many were appalled at you, his appearance was disfigured more than any man, his form more than the sons of men. See, here it's argued this must be talking about Israel, considering how well the Jewish people have been treated by the nations over the centuries. Right? Is that a genuine thing? Have the Jewish people been treated well by the nations over the centuries? Not so much. The nations have been appalled. They have been horrified, disgusted, to the point of recoiling from them, blaming from them, abusing them, isolating them into certain neighborhoods and ghettos, right? Those are all kinds of things that have happened. And by the treatment of the nations, it's argued that Israel has been disfigured and damaged more than any other, and history is full of such instances. The Jewish people have been the target of the enemy from the beginning, seeking to kill them off so God would break his promises, so Messiah can't come. But one thing to keep in mind in this whole sequence that we'll get to in days, next week or so, the nations are held accountable for how they treat Israel. The nations will be judged by that standard. Those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. If you think back to even to the Exodus, Amalek, his memory is going to be blotted out. Why? Because they came out and fought against Israel as they were fleeing Egypt. Zechariah chapter 2 verse 8 says, he who touches you, talking about Zion, touches the apple or the pupil of God's eye. Verse 12, or chapter 12 verse 9 in Zechariah says, God will destroy all nations that come against Jerusalem. Isaiah himself says, I'm missing a slide here. Where'd that go? Well, let's see, this is what I get for being in a hurry and moving things around. But when you think about historical examples of things, there's an Oxford-trained British Bible teacher, Derek Prince. He says this about it. He noted many years ago that Britain emerged victorious from 2 world wars, retaining intact an empire that was perhaps the most extensive in human history. But in 1947 and 48, as the mandatory power over Palestine, Britain opposed and attempted to thwart the rebirth of Israel as a sovereign nation with her own state. And he was actually living in Jerusalem at the time, so he was like an eyewitness of all of this. He goes on to say, from that very moment in history, Britain's empire underwent a process of decline and disintegration so rapid and total that it cannot be accounted for merely by the relevant political, military, or economic factors. Today, less than a generation later, Britain, like Spain, is a struggling and second-rate power. All starting in 1947 and 48. Now, what's important to ask, are we following in their example right now? We sure seem to be. As a nation, we have not learned this lesson. And if that happened to them in less than a generation, what does that mean for us? One thing we need to state is that it might not take a generation, because we seem to be much more aggressively opposing them in these days than previous times. Isaiah 41:12 put it like this. This is the passage that should have been there before. He says, though you will look for those who contended with you, you will not find them. Those who warred against you will be as nothing at all. the nations, how they treat Israel, is a basis of how those nations are judged by God, not how they are saved. Because when they reject Israel, when they abuse and treat them badly, are they really rejecting and treating Israel badly, or are they rejecting the God of Israel? In treating them, they show contempt for Him. And yet, throughout this book, throughout Isaiah, it's over and over again, God tells His desires. He desires that all nations are going to come to Him in faith. All nations are going to stream up to the mountain of Adonai, and they're going to be taught His Torah and live by His Torah. And it's the servant that makes the way for that to happen. This disfigurement caused by the hand of men was the worst kind of torture. The Lamb, as the Targum relates, the Messiah, was not killed in a kosher way. And yet, not one bone was broken that would disqualify Yeshua from being an acceptable Passover lamb. That point is made intentionally. John chapter 19, he says, it was the day of preparation, and the next day was a festival Shabbat. So that the body should not remain on the execution stake during the Shabbat, the Judean leaders asked Pilate to have the legs broken and to have the bodies taken away. Y'all know why they did that, why they asked to do that. Because with their legs, they're able to push up and take a breath. But if their legs are broken, they can no longer do that. And so they are collapsing and they're not able to breathe anymore. And it makes everything go faster. Because the Romans were very good at what they did. They knew how to make something like crucifixion last for days. Because their idea of punishment was punishment. Right? So they asked to have the legs broken and have the bodies taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and then the other who had been executed with Yeshua. So the other two guys had their legs broken. Now when they came to Yeshua and saw that He was already dead, they did not break His legs, but one of the soldiers pierced His side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. That's a sign that He had been already gone for a while. He who has seen it has testified, and his testimony is true. He knows that He is telling the truth so that you also may believe. And these things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not a bone of His shall be broken. Again, that's Exodus 12:46 and Numbers 9. And again, another scripture that says, they shall look on Him whom they have pierced. See, somehow, in all of this, somehow through this suffering, the nations are cleansed of their sin against God and even against Israel. It says in chapter 52, verse 15, He says, so He will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of Him. For what had not been told them they will see, and what they had not heard they will perceive. That word for sprinkle is nazah, and it's first used in Exodus 29, verse 21, with the anointing and the consecration of Aaron and his garments, making them holy for service to Adonai. It's repeated numerous times throughout the book of Leviticus, where the priest, he'll dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before Adonai. Or it's also used in the reference to a person with leprosy to make them clean. The servant does that. Sorry about that. He will sprinkle many nations. He is the one giving cleansing for them. It doesn't make sense if the nations are going to be judged by how they treat Israel, that this suffering is what makes their cleansing happen. It's the servant that does that. And while Israel is always supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, to be a light to the Gentiles, Isaiah is proving over and over again how they hadn't fulfilled that calling, and they can't save themselves. And Israel's suffering at the hands of the nation brings greater judgment from him, not salvation. Assyria and Babylon, they were instruments of God. They were chosen by God and used by him to judge Israel, but it was their excess. It was the fact that they were brutal, that they went well beyond his command into cruelty, that he destroyed them, and they don't exist anymore. Kings will shut their mouths because of Messiah, because of him. They will realize that there is an authority greater than them. The nations haven't shut their mouths because of Israel. The nations are continuing to rage against Israel, including our own. Again, we see this on the TV every day. But many kings over various times have submitted to Messiah, at least for seasons. Many nations have adopted much of the Torah without even realizing it, as our own has done that. And that phrase that says, "For what had not been told them, they will see," that's an interesting one. For those nations, they were sprinkled clean because they believed in things that were not originally given to them. For what had not been told them, they're going to see. They hadn't heard his voice on the mountain. They hadn't seen his miracles like crossing the Red Sea and the defeat of Egypt's gods. But somehow those kings are still going to see. They're going to perceive. They're going to understand. They're going to receive a cleansing that the servant provides. Because those nations, they didn't need a conquering king. They didn't need the Messiah, son of David, to come and judge the nations. Again, when he does that, they don't exist. And if the servant came to fulfill that role, the nations would all have been defeated. They all would have been killed without any hope because of how they have treated Israel. When you look back at Moses' life, didn't he start out that way the first time? When Moses first came to his people, he tried to be a redeemer and a deliverer by force. And when he saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, remember what happened? Moses, he looks around for any witnesses that could get him into trouble, and what did he do? He killed the Egyptian. But even when he did that, even when he did it that way, by force and not God's way, even then Moses was rejected as a leader and a deliverer at the time. It said, "Who made him a ruler and judge over us?" But again, that wasn't the way God wanted to redeem his people. Even to give a hope and a future for Egypt, as it's talked about in Zechariah. He had to be humbled first and come back to Egypt as a servant of God, not this military hero. God was going to do all the fighting for them. It was his mighty hand, it was his outstretched arm that won the battles, not even Moses. And even then, when he was doing it God's way, was Moses welcomed with open arms all the time? No. Was he always accepted for what he did? Were there no challenges to his leadership or his authority or his position? No. He was constantly challenged and questioned, but it was his humility, it was his service that made him fit to be the instrument of God's deliverance. That's similar in many ways to the way that salvation that God provided through Joseph. Joseph saved his family because of his rejection, because of his mistreatment and suffering by his brothers, at the hand of his brothers. It was through his suffering that he was exalted and raised up, second only to Pharaoh, that Joseph saved Egypt first. Isn't that kind of weird? Egypt was saved before his family was saved. He wasn't recognized by his brothers because of the disguise put on him as he was lost among the nation of Egypt. Joseph was dead as far as they knew. No longer a part of them at all as far as they knew. But all the while he was alive in Egypt. And the message that he was alive, when it was finally delivered, when it was finally revealed and shown to them, there was elements of fear, but there was also elements of joy when they looked upon their brother. And when that message was given back to Jacob, they told him, saying, Joseph is alive, and he is ruler of the whole land of Egypt. His heart went numb, for he did not believe him, talking about Jacob. But they told him all of Joseph's words that he had told them. And when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to pick him up, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Later on in chapter 46, it says, Joseph harnessed his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell upon his neck and wept on his neck for some time. And then Israel said to Joseph, At this time I am ready to die, after seeing your face in person, for you are still alive. Jacob could barely believe their words. And if you look at Isaiah 53, that's how it opens up. Who has believed our report? To whom is the arm of the Lord, or the arm of Adonai, revealed? Who could have predicted that God would save his people and save even the nations through rejection and suffering? Instead, the nations needed a servant that would cleanse and redeem them. Israel needed a redeemer like Moses who would lead them and the nations in this greater exodus. And that servant is the one that had no beauty or majesty, as we'll talk about in weeks ahead. He had no beauty or majesty that we should think that this is the one. But he was instead despised and rejected. He was one who bore our griefs, was crushed because of our transgressions. As by his stripes we are healed. That's how our redemption was made with the servant, Messiah Yeshua, the Passover Lamb. That is our hope. That is the promise.